So after we did the Louisiana Purchase, we just got a whole bunch of new lands, so Jefferson wanted to explore the new lands. To this effect, he set out these two dudes named Lewis and Clark to explore the Louisiana Purchase and also just to see how far west the United States stretched. So they departed from St. Louis, represent, and explored areas including the Missouri River, the Yellowstone River, and the Rockies. Sacagawea was their Native American tribe guide. She was from the Shoshone tribe, and she is going to help them on their journey. This is ultimately going to open up new territories to the American expansion. Therefore, Lewis and Clark are my homeboys. The embargo of 1807 was the American declaration to keep its own ships from leaving port for any foreign destination. Basically, we got to the point where we're fed up with all this Napoleonic fighting, and we don't want anything else to do with it, and we don't want to risk our sailors' life. So Jefferson hoped to avoid contact with vessels of either of the warring sides in these wars, and the result was an economic depression in the United States, which angered the Federalists, who were well represented in the Northeast, where, because manufacturing was the primary means of their economy, they were being hurt financially. James Madison is going to become the fourth president. Any president who took over after Jefferson was going to live in the shadow of a giant. Madison was known as the father of the Constitution because of his work towards the Constitution, and he participated in the writing of the Federalist Papers. In Congress, he was responsible for the Virginia Plan. He was a Republican president in the Federalist-controlled Congress, and he faced pressure from war hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. War hawks are people who like war, to get involved in the Napoleonic Wars and end the damaging embargo. Ultimately, because he was hesitant, it led to U.S. entry into the War of 1812, and then during his presidency, it's also going to conclude in 1814. He is the one whose wife took all the china out of the White House and fled when it was on fire and that type of thing. The Non-Intercourse Act, giggle giggle, Congress opened trade to all nations except France and Britain, so it was kind of lifting the embargo, but not completely. The trade boycott appeared to have little effect on curbing French and British aggression stemming from the Napoleonic Wars. Though the Embargo Act was a protective measure, this act re-engaged the U.S. in trade, while continuing its stance against alliances with either Britain or France. And so it was seen as kind of like us trying to take a middle ground route, which is what got Britain and France mad at us in the first place. So it was repealed in 1810. Fletcher v. Peck was a Supreme Court case, again in the Marshall Court, and this is the first time state law was voided on the grounds that it violated a principle of the U.S. Constitution. In this case, Georgia had issued a bunch of land grants in a very, very corrupt bargain, and it wound up being sued over who had the right to these land grants. Legislative session repealed the action because of the corruption. It was pretty obvious that bribes had been involved and stuff like that. And the Supreme Court case decided that the original contract was valid regardless of the corruption. So it overturned the Georgia state legislature, and it reaffirmed the sanctity of contracts, meaning if you make a contract, that is legal and binding, even if it's corruptly done so. The expansion of the electorate in 1810 to 1828 just basically means that in that 18 years, most states eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which is going to allow more people to have access to voting. African Americans were still excluded, and you also have the emergence of national nomination conventions, which is pretty timely given all the conventions that we have going on now. Tecumseh was a Native American chief who was encouraged by British forces to fight against the pressured removal of Native Americans from Western territories. So the British would give him training, supplies, weapons, in efforts for him to lead Native American rebellions against white settlers. William Henry Harrison destroyed the United Native American Confederacy, ultimately defeating Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe. In terms of the War of 1812, the main cause was the British impressment of American sailors. Again, not, ooh, you're impressing, but ooh, you're now held captive. The U.S. suspected the British of encouraging Native American rebellion, which it was. War hawk congressional leaders such as Clay and Calhoun, who pressed for intervention, they got sick of us basically being walked on, and they wanted to show that we were strong. American frontiersmen wanted more free land, as the West was held by Native Americans and the British. War hawks also wanted to annex parts of Canada and Florida. And then, despite the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act, hostilities could not be cooled, so we tried to take this middle route, but both sides kind of tried to force our hand, and eventually we're going to side with France against the British. As a result, early victories at sea by the U.S. before it was overpowered by the British ultimately is going to eventually lead the British to invade mainland America and actually burn down the White House. The U.S.'s Admiral Perry took Lake Erie with the Navy. It opened the way for William Henry Harrison, the guy who just won at Tippecanoe, to invade Canada and defeat the British and Native American forces. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson, who's just a general at this time, led the American charge to the southwest, culminating in the Battle of New Orleans, which was a decisive conflict where Jackson defeated the British. But it's interesting because this battle actually occurred after the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war. So the war was technically done, and then we fight this other battle, and then we won, so it doesn't really matter. I mentioned a couple times now that Washington was burned down. During the War of 1812, a British armada sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and burned down the White House. But that's okay. At the time, it's not okay, but at the time it was called the Executive Mansion, and it actually didn't get the nickname of White House until Teddy Roosevelt. The attack came in response to the American burning of Toronto. That's in Canada, but the British were mad about it. The Armada proceeded towards Baltimore, which was where America's Fort McHenry was sitting, and there was a dude there named Francis Scott Key who was like, oh my goodness, look at these Star-Spangled Banner and, ooh, rockets, red glare. So he's going to write this poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry about this bombing of Fort McHenry, and it's eventually going to become our national anthem. After the War of 1812, you have this increased fervor in American nationalism. More people wanted to be like, yay, America, we just won this war against big mighty Britain for the second time. It's going to create high foreign demand for cotton, grain, and tobacco, and the country turns from its agrarian origins towards industrialization, particularly in the Northeast. It's going to lead to a depression in 1819 due to an influx of British goods, and the Bank of the U.S. responded by tightening credit to slow inflation. The Rush-Bagot Agreement is how I say it. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended hostilities after the War of 1812, set the groundwork for the Rush-Bagot Agreement by encouraging both sides to continue to study boundary issues between the U.S. and Canada. Basically, they just wanted to work out any discrepancies that may exist in an effort to try to prevent further hostilities. This was an agreement between Britain and the U.S. to stop maintaining armed fleets on the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes were considered like demilitarized zone, if you will. And it served as the first disarmament agreement and laid the foundation for future positive relations between Canada and the U.S., which is good because we all like maple syrup, including James Monroe. I don't actually know if that's true. He was the 5th president. He was president during what's called the Era of Good Feelings, which is one of the longest time periods of no fighting, which was why it was called the Era of Good Feelings. It was marked by the domination of the Democratic Republicans and the decline of the Federalist Party. It established the Monroe Doctrine, named after, Monroe, as a wide-ranging policy for foreign affairs, which basically said, we're going to rule this hemisphere. No one else is going to have control over this hemisphere. National identity grew most notably through the western movement of the country and various public works projects. The era saw the beginnings of the North-South tensions over slavery as well, however. So not all good feelings. Again, the Monroe Doctrine, developed by President Monroe, helped the U.S. would not allow foreign powers to establish new colonies in the Western Hemisphere or allow existing colonies to be influenced by outside powers. So if you already had land here, you got to keep that land for the time being, but eventually you're going to leave. America feared international influence because of a period of worldwide revolutionary fervor after Napoleon's fall, particularly into the 1830s around Europe. You had a ton of these little revolutions break out all over Europe, and throughout the Caribbean in particular. Another cause was many Native American countries were gaining independence from Spain, and the U.S. thought that these colonies might be taken over by other European powers, which would threaten American security. So, for example, if Spain lost Cuba, then the question was, well, who else is going to come into Cuba? They might pose more of a threat to us. At least we know what the threat is with Cuba being under Spanish rule. The doctrine had a lasting impact beyond Monroe's time in office. Other presidents from Coolidge to Kennedy have invoked it to deal with the foreign affairs issues. The Convention of 1818 provided for a boundary between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel, that's west coast. It allowed for joint occupancy of the Oregon Territory by Americans and Canadians, and it permitted fishermen to fish in the waters of Newfoundland and Labrador, which are Canadian provinces today. McCulloch v. Maryland is another of the Marshall Supreme Court decisions. It said that no state could control an agency of the federal government. Basically what happened was the state of Maryland tried to raise a tax on a local branch of the U.S. Bank because it wanted to make it so expensive that the people of Maryland would bank with the Bank of Maryland before the U.S. Bank. And the Supreme Court determined that the state violated Congress's implied powers to operate a national bank. And so this was the use of judicial review over state law made this a division of powers case. So McCulloch v. Maryland, it was Maryland banking tried to override the state, or sorry, tried to override the federal government, failed. In Dartmouth College v. Woodward, again, it's another Supreme Court case by Marshall. It severely limited the power of state governments to control corporations, which were the emerging form of business. So basically, in this case, what happened was you had the New Hampshire legislature, which tried to change Dartmouth from a private to a public college by having its charter revoked. The court ruled that the charter issued during colonial days still constituted a contract and could not be arbitrarily changed without the consent of both parties. So once again, it's the idea that a contract made, even if times have changed, is still a contract. So kind of keep this in mind when you go and enter into contracts of any type in your future life. The Adams-Onis Treaty helped define the U.S.-Mexican border, so you can see that we're making efforts to really carve out our land and know what our land is. This border was under Spanish control and had created conflict between the two countries in the past. Spain sold its remaining Florida territory to the U.S. and drew the boundary of Mexico to the Pacific. The U.S. ceded its claims to Texas, and Spain kept California and the New Mexico region. The U.S. assumed $5 million in debts owed by Spain to American merchants, and later lands kept by Spain would become battlegrounds for American expansion. Instead of trying to memorize the exact lands that we gained through these treaties, I would say the most important thing is just to remember, like, Adams-Onis Treaty, that was us with Mexico, gained some of Spain's land. Like, that's what I would try to remember. Remember, we did that puzzle piece where we each, as a group, got, like, map pieces of the U.S., and we had to research, like, how it joined the U.S. and stuff like that. We did this whole activity dealing with this. So hopefully that sparks a little bit of memory for you. King cotton in the early 1800s, the new invention of the cotton gin separated the seeds from the fibers, making it faster to produce cotton, or clean it, I guess. And as new states in the new territories started producing cotton, we got their climate was better and more conducive to growing cotton. It led to the boom in the cotton market, and its global effect crowned the staple as King Cotton. The need of cotton encouraged westward expansion. Because we're moving west, we needed to also improve our transportation, so we had a transportation revolution during the early mid-1800s. Innovations included new construction of roads, additions of canals, and the expansion of the railroads. Robert Fulton becomes the father of the modern-day steamboat, which is going to allow for faster river transportation. Henry Clay has promoted internal improvements to help develop transportation. He's going to want taxes that are going to go towards improving roads, like interstates and stuff like that. Linkage to Eisenhower. And the transportation revolution cheapened the market for trade and encouraged population movement west of the Appalachian Mountains. During this time, you also have the Second Great Awakening and the Protestant Revivalism. So once again, people are going to turn towards Jesus when in doubt. A wave of religious fervor spread through a series of camp meetings. The Burnt Over District is an area in upstate New York, which was the center for this movement. Again, don't just draw church. Just know that people were once again turning towards their Protestant faith. It rejected the Calvinist doctrine of predestination and held instead that salvation was in the individual's hands. It was a reaction to rationalism, which it's like a reaction to the Enlightenment. It's like rationalism is where you want to like logic your way through, think your way through things. And this was like it was seen as not emotionally fulfilling, and so this was a reactionary response. Revivalism included participation by women and African Americans, demonstrating the influence and growth of democracy. It also created diversity in American religious sects and some anti-Catholic sentiments.